The lantern fell first. Glass shattered across wet concrete. Boots slipped. Someone shouted for morphine, but there was none left. Corporal Heinrich Adler didn't look up. His hands were already inside the chaos. Bandages, pressure, breath, another voice calling his name. Another stretcher pushed through the narrow barracks door. Another body he wasn't ready for. Outside, wind scraped against the wooden walls of the camp hospital hut. Inside, the air tasted like metal and smoke. Adler. He didn't answer. He hadn't slept in 30 hours. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence between the cries, the way the wounded men stared at him, waiting, as if he could stop something much larger than bleeding. A guard burst in. Another collapse near the outer fence. No explanation. No warning. No one understood it at the time. Adler wiped his hands on a torn sleeve and moved again. Step, kneel, press, time, move. The emergency had started without an alarm. And now it wouldn't stop. What they saw next changed everything. Because this wasn't a single injury. It was spreading. And before dawn, the medic would realize something that would keep him standing for days without rest. This wasn't an accident. But what was it? Winter 1945. A prisoner of war camp in northern Germany. The war was collapsing in on itself. Supply lines were broken, command structures fractured, and inside the camp, nearly 2,000 prisoners were waiting for something no one could define: liberation, transfer, abandonment. Corporal Heinrich Adler had once trained in a civilian hospital in Hamburg. Now he worked inside a converted storage barrack with cracked windows and 3 iron cots. He wasn't alone. 2 orderlies, 1 agging physician, and a locked cabinet that held fewer supplies every week. The camp had survived bombings nearby. It had survived shortages. It had survived rumors. But on this particular week, something shifted. It began with stomach pain in Barrack 12. Then fever. Then collapse. At first, it seemed manageable. But none of them knew what was about to happen. Morning light usually reached Adler before the whistle. He would wake before it, habit. Fold his blanket sharply. Wash with cold water from a tin basin. Check his notebook, always the notebook. Names, temperatures, small observations. He believed in order. Even here. Every day he made rounds at the same time, same sequence, same measured tone. Prisoners trusted routine. So did he. But 3 days before the emergency, something small disrupted that order. The bread ration arrived late. The water barrels tasted different. And one of the orderlies mentioned that Barrack 12 smelled off. Adler wrote it down. He noticed Private Klaus Ritter hadn't shown up for work detail. He noticed 2 men sitting instead of standing during roll call. Minor things. Almost nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. The physician requested extra disinfectant and was denied. No explanation. Adler closed his notebook slowly that night. He didn't know why the silence outside felt heavier than usual. He didn't know that within 48 hours, routine would mean nothing. The wind changed first. It carried smoke from somewhere beyond the camp. Then the coughing started. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just persistent. Footsteps in the infirmary grew more frequent. Fabric tore as makeshift bandages ran out. A guard whispered something to the camp doctor. No one else heard it. Water supplies were suddenly restricted. Barrack 12 was isolated. No written order, just word of mouth. Something disappeared from the cabinet that night. Adler checked twice. A crate of saline. Gone. No explanation. He began sleeping in a chair. The metal basin outside the infirmary filled with discarded cloths. And then the routine broke completely. 3 men collapsed within 1 hour. The first stretcher came at dusk. Adler noticed the trembling before the fever. He adjusted the blanket. Checked the pulse. Too fast. Outside, more boots running. The second collapse happened near the outer fence. A guard carried the man halfway before stopping, afraid to come closer. The word contagious floated in the air, but no one confirmed it. Adler didn't step back. He stepped forward. Hours blurred. 1 man stabilized. Another worsened. The physician argued quietly with a camp officer. No transport available. No evacuation authorized. But that wasn't the worst part. By midnight, Adler realized something chilling. It wasn't spreading randomly. It was concentrated. Barrack 12. The water line feeding that section had been rerouted 2 days earlier. He didn't know why. He didn't have proof. But the pattern wouldn't leave his mind. And still, he kept working. Through dawn. Through another night. Through shaking hands that refused to drop the instruments. He hadn't slept in 2 days. And the emergency wasn't slowing down. 3 days later, the fever wave stopped as abruptly as it began. No official announcement. No recorded explanation. Adler finally stepped outside the infirmary into pale morning light. He felt older, quieter. The surviving men avoided Barrack 12. Something didn't match. The physician requested incident documentation. The records told a different story. Official log entry. Temporary gastrointestinal outbreak resolved. No mention of water rerouting. No mention of supply denial. No mention of missing saline crates. And 1 page from Adler's notebook was gone. He knew he hadn't removed it. Was this accidental or intentional? He folded the remaining pages carefully. He said nothing. The emergency ended. The fever dropped. The records were filed. But explanations never settled. Over time, 3 competing versions of that week circulated, quietly, carefully, never officially debated. Each one seemed plausible. Each one left something unanswered. According to the camp's formal report, the outbreak was classified as a temporary gastrointestinal infection caused by spoiled rations. Winter transport lines had been unstable. Food shipments were delayed. Storage conditions were poor. The log described it as localized, non-strategic, and successfully contained. On paper, it made sense. Cold weather, weak immune systems, crowded barracks. But that wasn't the worst part. The report never mentioned the rerouted water supply to Barrack 12. It never referenced the missing saline crates. It didn't explain why disinfectant requests were denied days before the outbreak. And 1 line stood out more than the rest. Isolation protocol enacted preemptively. Preemptively. Before the first documented collapse. How could isolation have been ordered before the illness was officially recorded? Something didn't match. The official explanation closed the case neatly. Too neatly. Among the prisoners, and later, among former guards, another version circulated. A damaged depot outside the camp had been struck during an air raid. Medical supplies were salvaged in haste. Water storage barrels may have been contaminated during transfer. The rumor suggested that command feared panic more than illness. So instead of announcing a risk, they quietly isolated one section of the camp. Barrack 12. The theory gained weight because of timing. The water line feeding that barrack had been adjusted 2 days before the first collapse. Adler had noticed. He had written it down. But then that page disappeared. Still, if this was simple contamination, why suppress documentation afterward? Why not record it clearly once the outbreak ended? Unless admitting contamination meant admitting vulnerability. Unless admitting vulnerability meant disciplinary consequences for someone higher up. The rumor explained the silence, but it didn't explain the missing supplies or the denied disinfectant request before any known contamination. Again, something didn't align. The third explanation didn't come from documents. It came from behavior. After the war ended, Adler declined commendation for service under emergency conditions. He refused to testify in camp evaluations. He declined transfer opportunities. He requested civilian discharge immediately. And for the rest of his life, he never spoke about that week. Not once. Colleagues later noted that he became unusually cautious about water sanitation. He double-checked storage systems obsessively. He kept duplicate notebooks, always in separate locations. He trusted routine, but never authority without verification. Silence can be trauma, but silence can also be knowledge. If the official explanation were true, why carry that weight? If the rumor were false, why never deny it? And if something else had occurred, something unrecorded, what was it? There is no surviving testimony from Adler confirming any theory. There is no preserved document fully clarifying the water rerouting. There is only pattern. Pattern in preparation. Pattern in suppression. Pattern in lifelong caution. 3 possibilities, each supported by fragments, each contradicted by something missing. Which explanation makes sense to you? And more importantly, what detail are we still overlooking? The sound stayed with him. Not the shouting, not the coughing, not even the boots against the concrete. It was the glass. Sharp, sudden, final. Years later, in a quiet clinic far from the camp, Heinrich Adler would still pause when a jar slipped from a shelf. His hands would steady automatically. His breathing would change. For a moment, he was back inside that barrack. Lantern light swinging. Smoke drifting along the ceiling beams. Another stretcher pushing through the door. Back then, he had not been thinking about history. He had not been thinking about blame. He had only been thinking about the next pulse, the next breath, the next decision. 3 days without sleep. 3 days of holding a fragile line between panic and order. When the fever wave ended, there was no announcement, no apology, no explanation, just silence. Barrack 12 reopened quietly. Water flowed again. Rations resumed their schedule. The camp itself would be dismantled months later. The war would end, files would be boxed, names would be archived. But something inside Adler did not return to routine. He no longer trusted a single system without checking it twice. He no longer wrote in only one notebook. He no longer assumed that records told the full story. And perhaps that was the real consequence of those days. Not exhaustion, not fear, but awareness. Awareness that emergencies do not always begin with alarms. Sometimes they begin with small adjustments no one questions. A delayed ration, a rerouted pipe, a denied request. And by the time the lantern falls, the event is already in motion. In his later years, Adler was known as precise, calm, unshakable under pressure. Patients said his hands never trembled. They didn't know why. They didn't know about the week when he worked until his vision blurred because stopping wasn't an option. They didn't know about the missing page. That page was never recovered. No archive contains it. No official record references it. Maybe it listed temperatures. Maybe it noted the water line. Maybe it contained nothing unusual at all. Or maybe it held the one detail that would have clarified everything. We will never know. History often remembers battles, generals, dates. It rarely remembers the medic who stayed awake when systems failed. The man who kept moving while explanations disappeared. The lantern shattered. The emergency spread. The records closed. But in the quiet that followed, one truth remained. He had seen how fragile order could be. And once you see that, you never unsee it. The lantern fell first. And in some quiet corner of memory, it is still falling.